Howdy, hey, just wanted to make a quick video to talk about playblasting in Maya and very particularly for my courses, but also just get information. If you run into any issues and you're kind of frustrated with some of the playblast issues that people typically run into, rather. All right, cool. So I've got my bouncing ball animation, really simple, nothing too crazy. And I want to playblast this to share with my classmates, my instructor, my team, my animation lead, etc., etc. From Maya, what we can do is right-click Timeline and say Playblast Option Box. It's also up here in the menu somewhere. I always forget exactly where it's at. I believe it's in the animation menu. And then we go to Playback, Playblast Option Box. Whichever one you suits your fancy. But I want to make sure to go into the option box because I want to talk about these very specific settings. And we'll zoom into this and discuss what I'll be changing. So these first 4 settings, I am going to leave by default. Multi-camera output can be functional and helpful if we have multiple cameras, but we're not going to worry about that at this moment. Instead, going down the line, we're going to go down to Format. By default, this is set to AVI. In fact, I'm going to say reset my settings, so it's going to be by default what you're set to. If you have QuickTime or QuickTime Alternative installed, instead, when you click this drop down from the format, you will see QT, AVI, or Image. Currently, let's talk about QT, and that just means QuickTime, and it will export out a .mov file, which is really helpful. It is, it's going to be a better file type than a .avi, and the reason that is largely due to file size and quality. So with a specific encoding, what we can do is change this to, instead of PNG encoding, we can go to, scroll up, H.264. You got other 2 versions of the H dot, but those are older, and if you scrolled up a little bit, wish it was in alphabetical order, but Maya. So if you scroll up a little bit, you can go to H.264. I'm going to pump this quality all the way up, and between these 3 settings, we've changed the format to a .mov file. The encoding is how the actual file gets encoded into a .mov file, essentially. It's a bunch of text stuff, don't worry about it. The answer is H.264 because it gives you a high quality at a low file size. That second one's very important, so is the first one. And then finally, this quality is the actual quality of what we'll be rendering out. It's similar to the scale that we'll come back here in just a second, but just crank this up to 100. I will discuss caveats with this here in just a second, though. Display size, typically you're going to be changing this from window to from render settings. And if you have your render settings set up with the appropriate frame aspect ratio that you want, you're fine. If you've not set that up yet with your cameras, or in your render settings rather, you can say custom and you can choose the format here. I'm going to put 1920 by 1080 for today's purposes. The scale is going to be a percentage of whatever your display size is. So it's going to be, if it was render settings, custom, or window, our scale is going to adjust whatever that resolution pixel ratio is, okay? If it's set to 0.5, that means it's going to be 50% of 1920 by 1080, which means it's going to be, 960 by 540. So instead, I want to make sure that this is 100% scale. So it's going to actually put out 1920 by 1080. We get a nice, large, quality render. Frame padding, don't worry about. That's more so for image. We'll come back to that and talk about that here in a bit. Remove temporary files, fine to check on, but I like to check on save to file and browse to where I'll save this. I'm currently working in a project folder. In fact, I want to set this real quick, file, and I'll just set it back to my default Maya's folder for today's purposes. I'll just set it back to that. I will set my project there, and you can see when I hit browse, it's going to take you to the movies folder, and that's where this is going to save this to. I can give this a name in this window as well. If I choose to hit browse in the Playblast Options, I will call this Bouncing Ball Playblast, and I will hit save on the right side of the screen. We can get out of the magnifying tool for now, and we can discuss a little bit more of the next steps. I can do one of 2 things. I can hit Playblast or apply. If I hit Playblast, it's going to minimize that window and Playblast my scene at those settings. Fantastic. We ran into an error, and when my computer tries to go play this, I'm going to get this error. I say fantastic, but that's not really fantastic, is it? we run into this error a lot with this specific image format encoding. This is a relatively newer thing, and having looked into it online, it's essentially Maya's not using the thread count on your PC properly. I say Maya, but I believe instead of Maya, it's the actual encoding process of the video. So it's not even a Maya or Autodesk thing. I think it's a just that encoding process. If you have a better computer with more threads, it doesn't work all the time. So if you run into that, not everybody runs into that, but if you do, one caveat to get away from that is to pump your scale down. I'm going to put that to 0.5. I hit apply, and let's see. It's going to ask if I want to overwrite that. Let's see if this works this time. There we go. And essentially, what scaling down that overall ratio does is allow it to write a smaller file size and successfully encode this video. You won't always have to do that, especially if you have a lot less frames than I do. I currently Playblast at 120 frames. So if you have a lot less frames, you may not run into that issue, okay? And you may not need to scale it down. Ideally, we want to leave that scale at a full value of 1. All right. So that's one issue covered. That's the ultimate workflow, and I can navigate on my computer to my documents folder, my default Maya projects folder, and go into the movies, and there it's located. I've got my Playblast. Additionally, if this does not work for you, we have some extra steps that we can do, and we'll go back into a little bit of a zoom here. Instead of using the Qt format, do not use AVI. It's going to make a very, very large file, and it's going to be difficult to deal with. Let's use image instead. And I will choose encoding. We won't use GIF. And what I recommend is you're going to have to play around with this to kind of figure out which one works best for you. But JPEGs or PNGs will work well. I'm going to try on JPEG today. I've not tried one of those in a while. I'm going to leave all my other settings the same. Display size custom. Yours could be from render settings, whatever you'd like. Scale, I'm going to put back up to 1. And I'm going to choose the location. Currently, it's going now to my images folder output in Maya, just like any render would go. I'm going to create a subfolder in here, and I'm going to say bouncing ball Playblast sequence, or SEQ for short. And put it all caps. That way I have a subfolder for this, and I can also name it down here, bouncing ball, then SEQ. The files of type, don't worry about that. Just give it a name here because we've given it the encoding format up top. So the reason I created a subfolder is if you have multiple shots that you're playblasting in your images folder, that's going to get really busy and really overloaded and overwhelming to look through. Create your folder systems to help you out. I want to hit Playblast, let it do its thing. And after Maya playblasts an image sequence like this, it opens this software called fcheck, and it runs through. I'm not a big fan of fcheck. I feel like they haven't touched this piece of software in probably over a decade. So I'm not even going to let it do its thing. You can see it has a command prompt window that it opens to just run through and load all these images into the fcheck. It's just now finished 120 frames. It's an older piece of software, so I'm going to close it out. And if I navigate not to the movies folder of that project folder, but the images, there's the folder I created. And inside are my image sequence from the bouncing ball. Cool. So what is the benefit of doing this, and how do I convert this into a video? Currently, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to pause this recording, but I'm going to launch an editing software. Right now, I'm going to use Premiere. You are free to use After Effects, DaVinci Resolve, whatever. You can import an image sequence and export an image sequence out. I'm going to launch Premiere and get that going. Okay, I have Premiere opened up. It's pretty blank. The splash screen kind of came up and went away. But I'm going to say create a new project and just create an untitled default Premiere project. Folder is fine. Again, DaVinci Resolve, whatever you're creating there, that's going to look fine. I don't need this tutorials panel. Close it out. I'm just going to import the media. And to do this, I don't want to select all these files and click and drag here. No. Instead, I'm going to double click in the import media or go to file import and navigate on my computer to that default Maya's project folder or wherever you saved yours. Go to projects, default, and images. And I'm just going to select that first image and check on image sequence right here in this window in the bottom left, right there. And the reason that we want it to be image sequence is we want Maya, or Premiere rather, to think of these as sequentially. And we just need to select the first one and say open. It'll create our image sequence down here. You can see in the thumbnail as I'm scrubbing through it, we can get a preview If I click and drag that to my timeline, that's incorrect. And the reason being is when we first imported image sequence into this software, After Effects, and potentially any other software, we just want to ensure that it's the right codec. So I'm going to right click, say modify interpret footage. And again, I'm just right clicking that thumbnail, modify interpret footage. And I want to go to assume this frame rate. And I'm going to say 24. And I'll zoom in so everybody can see this. So interpret footage is set to 24. So now I can say, okay, now we're at 24 frames per second. The reason I chose 24 is this is what I was animating at in Maya. Lower right-hand corner below your timeline, you'll get to see what you're animating at. If you're animating at 30, you would leave it at 30. If you're animating at 60 FPS, you would change this to 60 FPS in here and in your sequence here. Now when I grab that and bring it out to my timeline, it's going to auto-update this to be 24 FPS. My timing isn't sped up or slowed down. We're good to render this out. To render this out from Premiere, the steps would be either to hit Control-M or go to File, Export, Media. And it'll take you to this screen. Only a few settings here, nothing too crazy. First off, the file name, and then the location. I'm going to click the blue words to choose the location, and I'm going to choose on my system, Documents, Maya, 20 or Projects, Default. I'll say this is my movies folder, Bouncing Ball, Sequence, and that's fine. Secondly, we just want to make sure to say, hey, make sure this is H.264 and an MP4. So as long as this drop down here in Premiere is set to H.264, you're good. Everything else we can ignore. And at the lower right corner of this screen, we can say export. And if we pull this folder up, go back to my project folder, go to movies, and check this file out, and right click and say properties. It also says it at the bottom of this window. But this is only 1.6 megabytes. In comparison, let's go back to Maya, sorry. And I'm going to change this to a AVI at a full quality, and we'll make sure that this is now being saved to my movies folder. And I will say this AVI bouncing. And I'll hit Playblast. And let's compare the file sizes, shall we? So even though that successfully went through, this is 711 megabytes. 1.6 versus 711. Almost a gig for 120 frames at 24 FPS, which is 5 seconds of animation. And this is very simple. There's not a lot happening here, not a lot of pixels moving around. Avoid the AVIs at all costs. Select that, Shift, Delete. All right. That being said, before I end this video, and I want to end it by talking about how to make a pretty Playblast. There's a couple of aspects that we can do. I can enable my film gate if I wanted to showcase, hey, this is the framing of my scene. I'm never a fan of the outline of the camera that it gives us, this gray outline. So I like to select my camera, go to my attribute editor, and down under the display options on the right side here, we get the options to change the opacity to make this more or less see-through. So I'm going to increase that all the way to 1. And then we can change the color to whatever color you want. Black is the correct answer. We're cinematic. We'd like to get rid of the extra noise so that we can focus on your work. So if you want to have a display gate, make sure to set those settings in proper on your camera. Additionally, what we can do to make this a prettier Playblast is a couple of other things. I want to get rid of the grid. Up here at the top, I can select the grid option. It's also, I believe, under Show Viewport Grid, down here under Viewport Utilities. I can just get rid of that via that method. Whoops, there we go. That was the resolution gate, which is that rectangle with a blue symbol in it. Cool, what else can we enable? What I recommend is anti-aliasing. I already have it here enabled, but that is this half blue circle with this half pixel circle. Recommend enabling that. And if we get close, and I'll zoom in so you can kind of see, if you look at the silhouette of that sphere, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what it's doing, especially with this simple scene. On more complex scenes, it's a little bit easier to tell. Regardless, I recommend checking that on. Currently, both my objects are this default gray color. Never do that. But if I hold Alt and hit B as in background on my keyboard, I can cycle between the different types of backgrounds in Maya to look for a nice contrast. Here, this is pretty good. We can enable lighting. I can go to say create lights. We'll add a directional light in and I'll aim it down at my object. There's this light bulb icon on your screen, or you can hit 7 on your keyboard. 6 and 7 will take you from default shaded or default lights to 7, which is the lights in your scene. So we can put this light however we would like it. And right next to that icon on your shelf here is a shadow icon. So we can enable shadows as well. Shadows are a bit tricky with Playblasts. Sometimes their quality is bad, sometimes their quality is good. What you want to do is select your light. Currently I have my directional light selected. I'm going to go over to shadows. And I'm going to say use depth map shadows. And you can see if that number is a little bit lower, that shadow gets really pixelated. Instead, I'm going to crank that all the way up to the right as far as I can take it. Additionally, this filter size right below the resolution, I'm going to increase. Typically 5 is good, but we'll try 6 out. And what that does is it helps soften those edges of the shadows. And that's typically all that I need to do as far as shadows go. So now I have a much better looking project to turn in. I always like to subdivide my meshes if they're low poly. That way they don't have the appearance of polygons, but instead they're a little bit more softer edges. Let's take this a step further. I'm going to increase the size of my disk here, my platform, so I can see more of the shadow. I have my directional light, which is great. We get our nice shadow from it. I'm going to play with the color of this light. I'm going to introduce a little bit of warmness to it, but not entirely warm, right? It's going to be mostly white, but just a hint of that orange, that nice warm color. Our shadows here are perfectly black, perfectly dark. We cannot see into them, and it is hard to see any detail if there is detail. Here, not so much. Your projects it may. What you can do is create another light. Create light, ambient light. This light fills the entire scene. So you typically want to select it and decrease its intensity down to something like 0.25. And then I can go back to my primary light and also decrease its intensity. Let's say 0.75. So that they both add to 1. Not that you have to do it that way, but you can. Additionally, with my ambient light, the one that fills the whole scene with light, I want to select the color, give it a little bit more of a cooler color. There we go. So now these shadows kind of across my scene has just a little bit of a different shade to it. And now it feels a little bit nicer to look at. I can play around with my lighting a little bit more, and if I want to increase that intensity so that I can easier see that, I can. But this is what I like to call a pretty Playblast. If I was to Playblast this right now, I'm going to have these two objects showing in the Playblast. I don't want that. You can choose what gets displayed and what doesn't get displayed with your Playblast under Show, Viewport, and we can disable a lot of options in here. Additionally, note right above Viewport, we have Playblast Disport, and we can say, hey, for my Playblasts, override what I have in the viewport, and I don't want to see anything, so I'm going to say none, and I'm going to go back to it. By the way, we can click this top menu bar to tear that off, and we have it all the time over here. So I'm going to say override my viewport. I'm going to say none of these options, except I will manually go choose polygons, and polygons will be enabled. Additionally, enable the viewport utilities such as HUD if you choose to showcase this border of your resolution gate. Otherwise, it's going to be disappeared. It's going to be disappeared. It's not going to be visible when you Playblast, and it's going to awkwardly crop your scene. So now, let's give that a view. I'm going to use the QT at a scale of 0.5. I do this a lot as I'm working personally because I don't like to trust Maya's playback speed as an animator. I like to, have control over that. So I Playblast a lot. And this isn't going to be something I turn into my team or my instructor. So a scale of 50% is fine. I'm going to change the title of this. I'm going to call it lighting. test, ball, and Playblast. Aha. See, the grid came back. So it's good that we do these tests. And what we can see here, oh, it's encrypted with a PNG. Oh, did I not change that? I did not. So not only can I go back and change this to H.264 now, there we go. I can also go back over here and under my viewport utilities, disable grid and hit apply. It's going to ask if I'd like to overwrite the previous file. Yeah, no need to hold on to them. And so now I have a nice Playblast that I can preview my animation with and share with my team if I so choose. But it's just kind of testing these things out, right? We're not seeing these lights in our scene, even though in my viewport I am, because we're overriding the viewport information here. One last thing I want to discuss, which is the background gradient. Remember earlier I said you can Alt and hit B on your keyboard to cycle through the different types of backgrounds in Maya. This one that has a gradient, we can change the color of. If we go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Color Settings, at the very top with 3D views, we can change the gradient top and the gradient bottom. So if we didn't want green to black, we could, or blue to black, we could have green to black, yellow to black, gold to black, whatever color suits your fancy. I don't necessarily recommend changing this to get it back to its defaults. You can say edit, reset to defaults. I don't recommend it, but if you so choose, you're more than welcome to. If you do this, by the way, in our Playblast settings, when you do an image, if you have to do that technique, you can come up here to the encoding, and instead of choosing PNG, that'll give you a black background. Choose JPEG, and that will give you the background that we're seeing here in Maya. And let's make a new one just to double check and confirm this. JPEG EG test, and we will say open and JPEG BG test. And let's Playblast that out at a full scale to see what that looks like. There we go. So I hope this helps give you an idea of how you can do a pretty Playblast and get that going nicely and easy for you to turn in small file sizes and upload to your Sync Sketch or to your instructor's OneDrive or to your Discord or your Slack channel, wherever, however you're sharing this with your fellow animators in your team. Hope you have now a better confidence of how to go about that. Thank you and take care.